Hello there, my name is Seguya Hamid from Kimdi Group Design Team, and today we have brought you an integrated structure, meaning it has two sets of animals using the same housing. This structure occupies a space of 0.15 acres and it has 300 goats and 20 cows. Let's talk about our project. This project has the following facilities. Just to briefly highlight what we have on this project. We have a store, we have staff quarters, we have water points, and that housing structure itself, which has on the first floor the goat structure, and then on the ground floor the 20 cows. If you would allow me, let me engage you through the cow section. Our design is an all-weather design. By this I mean you don't have to worry about which season it is, wet or dry. Your animals are going to have the same facilities they need, whether they are indoors or outdoors. Let's go through the cow section. The cow section is designed in a way that we have sleeping structures for 20 adult cows. We have a milking parlor that goes up to 4 cows, and then we have a calf section for up to 8 cows. Let's talk about how the whole section is organized. We have the sleeping structures, of course, because of cleanliness. The floor of the sleeping structures is raised from the rest of the floor to allow droppings and waste not to be on the sleeping side, because you definitely want your animals to rest in a comfortable place that's free from that. Then, as for cleanliness in the structure itself, you know cleanliness is a very important aspect in farming, and of course when you mishandle cleanliness of the structure, you're definitely looking at issues like diseases, contamination of food, and things like that. Therefore, to avoid all these things, we have an easily cleanable flow in the structure, whereby the flow is meant to be in a way that easy runoff of waste is allowed in the structure. And on top of that, we have outlets on the structure which allow this waste that is being cleaned out, for example, or for example urine, to flow out with ease. And then outside our structure, just around, immediately around the structure, we have a trench. This trench is generally for things like runoff from the roof, and then waste itself from inside the structure. And the use of the trench is to allow this waste to be directed to a common collection point. Now, of course, we know waste from farming can be used for other things. For example, you have biogas, you have manure in the farm. For example, you have pasture plantation on your farm. This manure comes in handy because you don't have to now buy fertilizers from elsewhere. You just have to give it a bit of time, and then when it gets less acidic, it can be used on your plantation. Let's move on a little bit to the goat section. As I mentioned, our structure is storied. Therefore, on the ground floor is where our cattle are, and then on the first floor we have our goat. This may be a bit surprising too, because there's a lot of questions. How do you get to the first floor, for example? How do you manage cleanliness? I've just talked about cleanliness and all those things. Just to take a bit through the details, let's start with the partitioning. Our structure is partitioned to have animals, general flock separated from the back. So we have a back separation partition. We have the kids section, whereby that section basically has newly born kids and their mothers. And then we also have a pregnant mothers section. Why would you have partitions in your shed, you may ask? This is basically because, as we know, for those of you that have been in farming, and those of you generally who have been in society, you understand that not every other animal behaves the same. You have stubborn animals. This comes in as handy as it does because you have these partitions helping you with issues like miscarriages. You tend to have stubborn animals knocking around these other animals, so you may have miscarriages. You have newly born kids being trampled over or knocked even, and they die. So these partitions are usually helpful to avoid such things, because even animals get stressed. Now, when you mix all these, you find that your productivity in animals becomes less, and that is why we have these partitions. On top of that, they are also very helpful in controlled breeding. That's why we tend to separate the back from the general flock. Otherwise, you may want to have your animal breeding in certain periods and then not breeding in certain periods. But if you leave the back with the general flock, most of the time you find that you will not know when your animals got pregnant. So that is why we have partitions. Let's talk about the feeders. The feeders are partitioned, and this allows you to, first of all, reduce wastage of the feed. And then this partitioning stops animals from stepping into the feeder itself, because the partition only allows the head of the animal to pick out food from the feeder and then feed. For those of you that don't chop the grasses up, for example, those that feed your animals with pastures, this allows the animal to lift out just enough that it can chew and not lift a whole batch out and maybe throw it on the floor that may be dirty and leaving that food not used. Now, we talked about cleanliness of this structure. You may be wondering, on the first floor, how does the dirt, the droppings, the wastage, how is it cleaned out? Let's start with the setup of the floor itself. The floor is in a way that it's a timber floor, and usually we leave enough spacing in the floor between the boards to allow for the droppings to go through without actually injuring the feet of the animals. Because if the spacings are big, you're going to find that an animal may step in the space rather than on the board. Then, of course, a question comes up. The droppings from the goats, don't they fall down through the floor into the cattle? No. Why? We have a double roofing system. What I mean by this, we have a roof between the cattle section and the floor of the goat section, which means that the droppings of the goats do not actually fall in the cattle section, but rather are guided into our trench that is running around the structure. This roof is of course at a good angle that allows it to have those droppings run off without need for them to be swept off or washed off. And then when they drop, of course, into the trench, you can now start cleaning in the trench. You may need to clean the roof periodically, once in a while, maybe once like a month, but then that is the whole point of having it at a good pitch so that the runoff doesn't have to stay, so it actually makes the need to clean less a month. That's mostly about the goats. Let's talk about other facilities. For example, the exercising yard. We have a store, we have a staff quarters. Let's start with the exercising yard, for example. As the name may suggest, it's an exercising yard, whereby, yes, we have enough space indoors for the animals to, get around, eat, feed, exercise a little bit. But then it's not sufficient. So we definitely provide an exercise yard where they step out and then walk a bit. You may not know this, but actually animals need the sun as much as humans do. You have things like vitamin D you get from the sun and all that. Animals need that too. So you need to have an exercise yard on your structure, and that's what we have. Our design has an exercise yard. This one is fitted with outdoor feeders. It has a spray crush, but then also our exercise yard comes in a way that it is used for other activities. For example, you have spraying, you have castration, things like that that may not necessarily be done indoors. The spray crush allows you to separate a few animals, spray them at a time while others are out feeding or even just exercising. But then as well, remember that structure needs to be cleaned. So once in a while, you push the animals out of the structure, you have the shed cleaned very well thoroughly, and then this makes the work easy basically. Water points. Water is a very, very important resource in farming. Usually we encourage our farmers to have maybe a system of collecting rainwater and tanks to supply water to the feeding troughs, for example. Water is used for many things. There is cleaning, there is feeding, and irrigation even when you have pastures on the farm, items like that. So our design happens not to have a water collection point, but then the site itself has an existing well. So that is one way to go about it. I talked about a staff quarters. There is a saying that goes, feel at home. If you want to enjoy your project, you definitely have to have a structure that makes you feel at home. A place to rest after work, for example. A place to do your other human activities, cooking, feeding, things like that. So we have a staff quarters that allows people at the farm a little bit of space for their own activities, cooking and items like that. And that is all well planned with sufficient space, even parking. For example, you're bringing animals to the farm, you're bringing feeds and other things. That space is for those reasons. Then another usually ignored item, but then very important in our structures, we have a farm store. You have items like feeds themselves that are stored. You have pesticides, for example. You have a few other tools you may need, sprayers, things like that. These things need to be kept safely. Otherwise, if you keep them anywhere, throw them around, you're going to have to literally buy new items that could have lasted longer in shorter periods of time than they would have actually needed to be bought. So that's where the store comes in very important. And then, did you know that feeds that are air dried are actually more nutritious than those that are sun dried? Your farm store, if you can, could have an extended shade. It's an outdoor shade. It's covered from sunlight, but then it's not enclosed. This allows airflow, and then you can have that space used for air drying your pastures, especially if you're going to be making hay. That product from air dried pastures is usually more nutritious compared to that is sun dried. So You may want to consider that if you have space. But then for our particular design, we had limited space, so we had to work around an ordinary store that just has enclosed space, and then maybe we can work out some other way of drying our pastures. But anyway, that is it for our design. If you want more information, please look at other videos on our YouTube channel. Thank you for following us. And if you're interested in such a design, it can handle any capacity. It can also be an integrated structure for goats and chicken, for example. It can be one for cows and chicken. Just reach out to our company, as contact details may show. Thank you so much for listening to us. I'm Hamis again from KMD Group of Companies.